Hi, everyone, and welcome to this chapter. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about the provider package. As part of state management, you've probably come across this name, at least if you haven't used it before. And in this chapter, unlike the other chapters, we're going to go a lot more into details about this third-party package. Provider is nothing that is built into Flutter. Some people think that Flutter works with provider and it's just built into Flutter, and that's really not the case. Provider is kind of like a wrapper around inherited widget. And if you've followed the chapters in this course chronologically up to this point, you'll have noticed that I've already talked about inherited widget before. So inherited widget will allow you to reach from the bottom of your widget tree to the top. Somewhere in the top, it doesn't necessarily have to be the direct descendant, the direct parent of that widget that we're talking about, but it allows you to reach up in the tree and grab a widget or a provider. So in order for a provider to work, you need to work with context. And as you'll soon see, there are so many functions available on provider that allow you to watch changes in your widget tree, for instance, or select specific changes to watch in a widget tree. Or if you just want to interact with your provider, you can also do that with specific functions on your context. So the reason I'm mentioning this right now is that it's so important to understand how BuildContext works in Flutter and how that allows you to, or allows provider to give you more functionality that it could had there not been a BuildContext in the picture. This chapter is going to be a long one. So it is not just going to be done in 40 minutes or 45 minutes or even an hour. I want this chapter to go deep into provider, and we're going to have a look at 3 complete examples of how to integrate provider into 3 separate Flutter applications. For all these 3 applications, we're going to create separate projects. And then we're going to add functionality into these projects. And they're kind of going to be real life situations that you may encounter if you want to have provider in your application. So grab a cup of tea or a coffee because I think this chapter is going to be quite a long one. So let's go ahead and create our first project in here. I'm going to do some reshuffling here on the screen. Bring up terminal and make it ginormous so we see even if you're on a mobile device. Let's go create the first application or the first project in here. So let's say Flutter create, let's call it testing provider, and we're going to call it course. And then I like to add an organization here as well. So we're going to let that do its work. Okay. So after doing that, I'm going to just cd into this folder, and I'm going to bring up Visual Studio Code, which is the code editor that I prefer to work with almost for everything that I do, Python, Django, Rust, everything, except for iOS development, which you're supposed to use Xcode for. So let's in here then say select device, and I'm just going to go to the main Dart file in here, and we are also going to basically replace this entire thing with a simple scaffold. Okay, so I'm not going to explain this. It's just run app with material app, and there's a home page, which is a stateless widget, and it has a simple scaffold inside it. All right, just like that. Okay, now that is done, I'm going to run this application on an iPhone simulator. And while that is going on, we're going to go talk about the rest of the things that we need to discuss. So provider, as I mentioned, is a third-party package, and you can go and have a look at its GitHub repository. It's open source, of course, and I actually encourage you to have a look at the repository as well, just to get acquainted with the source code and its structure a little bit as well. So here's our application running. It's an empty application, as I said, is a scaffold with an empty home page right now. I'm gonna remove the widget inspector and also get rid of this debug console at the bottom of the screen. Okay, and I'm not gonna show this simulator so much because it blocks so much of the screen real estate, but we just know that it's there if we need it. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have to go and add this third-party package, which is called Provider. And the best way to do that is just to bring up the integrated terminal in Visual Studio Code and just say Flutter pub add Provider. All right. So this is going to go and grab the latest version of Provider for us, and it's going to bring it into our pub spec. Let's see, pub spec YAML. And if you look here, you can see it is Provider 602 at the moment. Excuse me. So there we go. So that's adding our dependency. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, Provider, along with a lot of other state management solutions in Flutter, and also including the built-in state management in Flutter itself, they work using inherited widget. And I've created a chapter in this state management course dedicated to inherited widget, which I really think you should go and watch, because it is a reason that I did that chapter before I did the Provider chapter, simply because understanding inherited widget and inherited model helps you a lot in understanding how Provider and many other state management packages work. So if you haven't done that already, you could do me a favor and go and watch the chapter about inherited widget, which is in this playlist, which you can find a link to the playlist at the bottom of the screen, or in the description section. So it's very important to actually understand that. What we're going to do in this chapter is to create a breadcrumb application, and I'll show you how that breadcrumb application looks like. So let me bring up the simulator, and we call it, this application is called Testing Provider. So I've already created that application, which we're going to develop, and it should look like this. So you can see it's a very simple application. It allows you, it has two buttons. Here it says add new breadcrumb, and then a reset button. Add new breadcrumb button sends you to a separate screen in which you can enter a new name. So in here, let's say phones. Okay, phones. And it then gets added here. This is a separate widget, which we're going to call breadcrumbs widget. And then as soon as I add a new one, let's say mobile, you can see that the phones one is actually now an active link. So, and you can also add another one, let's say Apple. Okay, and it adds it to the breadcrumb. So as you can see, as soon as we add a new breadcrumb, the previous ones get kind of activated so that the user can tap on them if they want to. We're not going to add a tap gesture detector to these in this chapter because that's kind of like outside the scope of this. We're just rendering them, but it kind of explains the logic. You've probably seen breadcrumbs before. Breadcrumbs are really good for simplifying navigation in deeply nested views, whether it's inside a website or it's in a mobile application. Unfortunately, mobile applications don't show breadcrumbs so often, and I see that a little bit as a problem, but that's my personal view. On iOS, if you have deeply nested views and view controllers that you're pushing on top of each other, you can always hold your finger on the back button and it will show you. I mean, this is actually a trick that not a lot of people know. You can press your finger on the back button to see the entire view hierarchy. We can have a look at that by going to, for instance, the settings page. Let's go to general and then keyboard and then hardware keyboard. So now we're a lot of levels deep. If you hold your finger on this, you will see now it's kind of like a breadcrumb. So you can like jump back to the settings if you want to. So that's iOS's way of implementing breadcrumbs, you could say. But in this application, we're going to do it this way. So we're going to have a widget that displays the breadcrumbs, and then we're going to allow the user to add new breadcrumbs, upon which we make the previous breadcrumbs, if any, as active. We'll mark them as active so that they become blue color. Then we will also have a reset button. So tapping on the reset button is going to reset this breadcrumb, as you can see in here. So there's lots of moving components in here, and even though this application is very simple, but it's going to take advantage of something called a ChangeNotifier, which is our provider, and we're also going to create a little provider which uses a builder to take this ChangeNotifier and create a UI out of that. Okay, I know it kind of like sounds a little bit abstract right now, but we're going to figure it out by the end of this chapter. So let's get rid of this terminal, the debug console at the bottom of the screen, and start coding. So I'm going to also go to the source code that I've prepared for this from before, testing provider. Okay, so what we need to do is to go ahead and create a class for this breadcrumb. This breadcrumb is going to have two properties, as you'll soon see. It's first going to have like some sort of a, a name, and it's also going to have a variable property called isActive. So, I mean, there are different design decisions that you can make in here. So you may want to have your breadcrumb as an immutable class, and then you may want to, for instance, upon you having to activate it or making it blue, you may want to create a copy of it and then put it in an array. I thought that is kind of like outside the scope of this chapter for me to go into that kind of discussion. So what we're going to do is just going to create a simple class that can become active or deactivated. Okay. So let's go ahead and just create a breadcrumb class in here. So I'm going to say class breadcrumb like this. Okay, and let's make the C capital in here. So as I mentioned, we are going to go and add two properties in here. One is active and the other one is name. So isActive is in fact a property that can be changed. So it's variable property. And the name is final, so you can't change the name. So let's say it's a string of name. All right. After doing that, as you can see, we have these two errors that this one of my favorite extensions in Visual Studio Code is highlighting those errors for me as like laying them out in line, and that extension is called Error Lens. I've explained this before in my free Flutter course as well. So if you want to download this Error Lens extension, you're more welcome to do that. So let's go ahead and add the, let's see, the constructor in here. So like that. So we're going to make this, this is active and this name, and let's make these required named parameters, okay, like this. Now they're required named parameters. And unfortunately, we can't make this class constant simply because we have a variable, of course. Let's go back to the application so that it can do a hot reload. Okay, now as I mentioned, when you saw in this example, let's go back in this application that we developed. As you can see, adding a breadcrumb, by default, its active state is going to be false. But as soon as we add a new breadcrumb, like let's actually call this one XXX or something at the end, the previous one becomes active. All right. So we need a function that can go to that and say, hey, you're now active. All right. So let's implement that function. So let's just say void activate. The only thing that this guy does is just says is active is equal to true. Okay, so that's it. And we could also, to be honest, we rename this to underscore is active, kind of saying like this is we don't want you to play with it. You could do that if you want to. You're more welcome to do that. So what we need then is, since we're adding these to a list, we also want to implement equality. So we want to be able to tell apart different breadcrumbs. Okay, so let's go ahead in here and just say override. Override, and it's a bool operator equal, and then we're going to say covariant breadcrumb other, and in here we're just going to say as long as is active is equal to other is active and name is equal to other name, then we are marked as equal as well. I mean, to be honest with you, this is not the absolute best implementation of equal, but it kind of demonstrates the purpose. I would, if I wanted to do this like correctly, I would add the UUID package to my application, and I will actually create a UUID for every breadcrumb, and then we could literally compare that. And we could do that. I mean, to be honest with you, we could add UUID right now and like fix this right now. So maybe let's do that. I'm like going off the tangent here, but let's do that. Let's just say Flutter Actually, where is it? Where am I? Here. Flutter pub add UUID. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to close this. Let's go ahead and import UUID, import package UUID like that. And let's add a UUID in here. So we're going to say final string UUID. And in here, we just say UUID is const UUID dot v4. So now we have a UUID. And then in here, we can just compare that. Okay. So let's say we say UUID is other UUID, just like that. All right. And as you can see, it's asking us to implement also hash code, and I can get help from Visual Studio Code to implement that. And for the hash code, I'm going to return the UUID's hash code. So that's just going to work like butter. So it just fits in. Okay. Then the last thing that we have to do in here is to calculate, or performing hot load is not working because I have to switch back to that application again. Now hot reload is working. Okay, now we have to calculate a little title. And what this title actually means is, if you look here, this item, let's add better breadcrumbs in here. Let's say mobile. You can see the title of this breadcrumb at the moment is mobile. So its title is its name. However, when I add a new breadcrumb and I say phone, the title changes to mobile space, and then it adds this little greater than sign in here, okay? With a space after that as well. So that's what we want to calculate. If a breadcrumb is active, we want it to have this little greater than sign space after it. So let's go ahead and add a property in here. We're saying string get title, and that is if it's active, and then we say it's equal to name, and then this, right? Actually, we could do it like this. We could just say it's equal to name plus, if we're active, then this. Otherwise, plus empty string. Okay, so this is a little bit more clever way of calculating that title. All right, great. So, so what are providers themselves? I mean, we're going to have some sort of like a state in here in our application that keeps hold of our breadcrumbs. So we could have from 0 to n number of breadcrumbs. And providers themselves are very simple. Like a provider is nothing magical. It is either a value notifier or a change notifier, for instance. So we've also talked about change notifiers and value notifiers in previous chapters. So if you're creating a provider, all you're basically doing is holding on to state and then notifying whoever's listening to you using, for instance, a change notifier that, hey, something changed internally. Go and do something about it. Okay. So that's what we're going to do in here. We're going to create a change notifier that manages our breadcrumbs. Okay. So let's go ahead and start the implementation for that. What we're going to say in here is say class breadcrumb provider extends change notifier. Okay. So you can see it's very simple. You just created a change notifier in here. Okay. So and this guy is then going to hold on to a list of breadcrumb objects. So we're going to add a list in here. We're going to say final list, and we're going to say a list of breadcrumbs, and we're calling it underscore items like this. Okay. Now that we have that, we are going to also create a read-only version of this items. So you can see in here, I prefix this with underscore in here simply because we don't want the outside world to know about this or manipulate this. So if you want to expose a read-only version of a list, your best bet is to create something called an unmodifiable list view. So let's say unmodifiable list view of breadcrumbs. And we call this a getter of item is equal to unmodifiable list view of our items. I think it's something like that. Okay, like this. All right, so what we did in here is we created a simple storage, which we can read from and write to. And we also created an immutable variant of the same list. Remember, lists in Flutter and Dart, actually more accurately in Dart, they are classes. Classes can internally change. This is unlike what you would have in Rust, for instance, that you would have a structure, and that structure can be either used immutably or mutably, and then you would mark them as MUT if you're mutably using it. But in Dart, you have a class, and that class can change. That's it, unless you have a constant instance of that class. And in this case, we don't have a constant because it makes no sense to have a constant list of breadcrumbs. It means it will never change. But we want that list to change internally in this provider, but we don't want the outside world to be able to change it. And that's why we're creating this unmodifiable list view in here. Okay. So we also need to be able to allow the outside world, for instance, our user interface, to add new breadcrumb instances to our breadcrumb provider. So we need a public function in here. So let's say void add, and we're going to say you add a breadcrumb in here. Okay, just like that. And in this add function, when you, as I mentioned, when you add a new item to your breadcrumb provider, you want to go through all the existing breadcrumbs in this items and activate them. So let's go ahead and say for final item in items, and we just say item activate. All right, and that activate like that, and that will give those items that look and feel that they will have that greater than sign as their part of the title when we will later actually render them as part of a widget, which you'll soon see how. After doing that, let's add this item, the new one, inside items. We say add breadcrumb. Okay, and in here, since we're a change notifier, we have to tell our listeners, capsule, that something has happened internally that changed the state of our provider. So that's with notify listeners right here. Okay. And as you saw in the UI of what we're developing, which looks like this, there should be a reset button. So pressing this reset button should remove all the breadcrumbs from these items, or this item, this items property. Okay, let's go and add that function. And that is going to be the reset function. So let's go and add a function here. We call it reset, void reset. And we say items, remove. We don't have anything. No, we should say clear. And then we say notify listeners as well. So this is going to notify anyone who's listening to our changes. And you'll soon see actually how we're going to implement that part, the listening part, to changes. Okay. Now that we have a breadcrumb class and we have this breadcrumb provider, we need to focus on how to render the breadcrumbs. We have no component at the moment that can render these breadcrumbs, depending on whether they're active or not, and also what their title is, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and create a little stateless widget for that. Okay, and after doing that, we need a widget to display our breadcrumbs on the screen. So if we bring back our simulator and have a look at how it looks like, if I reset this and let's say item 1, and then we say item 2, then we can see that these items are rendered next to each other. And if I add something that is a very long text that would wrap everything, and then you can see, oh, it was exactly at the edge. I just wanted it to go over the edge. So one more item. You'll see that it wraps to the next line. So we're using wrap in this example, the wrap widget. So we need a widget that can display our breadcrumbs. So let's go ahead and implement that. So I'm just going to say a new stateless widget, and we're going to call it breadcrumbs widget. And of course, in here, we need to grab an unmodifiable list of our breadcrumbs. So let's go ahead and say final unmodifiable list view of breadcrumb, and we'll call this breadcrumbs. breadcrumbs like this, okay? And of course, we need to add this in the constructor. So as I bring in the caption at the bottom of the screen. So, and let's make this also a required parameter in here. So just like that, okay? So that's really good. And performing hot reload is not working because we have to switch to our application, okay? So what we need is to actually implement our breadcrumb widget, and that's going to be using wrap. So I'll bring this caption up here. So let's go ahead in here and say we will use wrap, and wrap has a property called children, okay? So in this children, what we're going to do is to grab our breadcrumbs is on our unmodifiable list of breadcrumb, and we're going to map every one of these, okay? And let's just call the parameter breadcrumb like this. And we don't want an arrow function, we want an actual function, and we're going to say toList at the end, okay? And in here now, our responsibility is to create a widget for every breadcrumb, okay? So let's go ahead and just do a return text in here, okay? And for the text of the text widget, we're going to say breadcrumb, breadcrumb.title. Remember, we implemented the title before, so we don't have to do that in here. And the style is going to be a text style because we want the active breadcrumbs to be blue or bluish. So let's go in here and say the color is, if the breadcrumb is active, then let's just actually use colors blue. Otherwise, we're going to say colors black. So we're using a ternary operator in here, okay? And then we have to put a semicolon in here and maybe a trailing comma there and a trailing comma in here as well. Okay, so that created our breadcrumbs widget. All right. So what we need to do in here is to create now an instance of our provider. You can see we've created the provider, but no one's actually providing this to the entire application. So there is a class called ChangeNotifierProvider, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. And this ChangeNotifierProvider will allow you to create an instance of a change notifier, as its name indicates, which in this case is our breadcrumb provider. And it will be able to then provide that to its descendants, as you'll soon see. So what I always like to do is to actually have a look at the class hierarchy for things that I'm using. So let's go ahead in here and just provisionally just write change notifier provider. Okay, so I like to just go into their source code to have a look. As you can see in here, it says this thing needs an item that is a change notifier. Okay, and then it actually extends a class called listenable provider. Listenable provider in turn extends inherited provider, and inherited provider use a single child stateless widget, which I believe actually comes from another package. So I think this comes from stacked, or sorry, it's called nested, not stacked. So nested is a completely separate package that we haven't really talked about yet, but I believe I will actually do it in this course, perhaps at the end. So provider with itself brings in a dependency called nested, which we don't talk about right now, as I mentioned, but it's just good to know that this single child stateless widget is inside nested package, which provider then brings in as a dependency. And that itself uses something called a single child widget. And single child widget is also inside nested, as you can see up here. And that one implements widget, which then in turn is inside Flutter. So it is about 6 layers deep. And I highly recommend that if you want to work with ChangeNotifierProvider, which we're going to do in this chapter, that you actually spend a little bit of time having a look at its source code. It's always good practice to do that. So let's see. We will, as I mentioned, we will talk about some of these things a little bit more in depth later in this chapter, but we can't go into all those details, to be honest with you. It's always good to have a look at their documentation and source code on the side. So let's go ahead now and bring this provider to our application so that our UI widgets have access to it. And the way we're going to do it is to go up here in the material app and wrap our material app with our ChangeNotifier provider. So I'm just going to say here, wrap it with a widget, and it's a ChangeNotifier provider, just like that. We're going to have an error. We'll see soon how we're going to fix it. So as you can see, the error tells you that this ChangeNotifierProvider class has a property, has a parameter in its constructor called create, and is a required parameter, which we haven't provided. And this create gives you a build context, I believe. Let's have a look. Create. You can see it gives you a build context and expects you to return a change notifier. Okay, so let's go ahead and say create. We don't want the build context, and instead we're going to create our breadcrumbs breadcrumb provider, I think we call it. Yes, just like that. All right, so now we create the breadcrumb provider and bring it into the build context of the application from this point on. So the child of this ChangeNotifier provider's build context will have access to our breadcrumb provider in this manner. Okay, as you saw in the actual example that we developed here, when we go to this thing, when we press this add new breadcrumb, it actually goes to a new screen. So we need a new route for that. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a little route in here, and we're just going to call it /new. So in here, we're just going to say routes. Let's see. Routes, just like that. And this is a map of string and a material route. So let's just say /new. And I'm going to bring the code a little bit higher so you can see it better. And let's say we take a context, and in here we just say const material for now, because we don't really have any new screens. We haven't developed any new screen at the moment. So it's just okay to return a material for now. Okay. Since we've, let's go back to our application. So hot reload is going to work like that. Since we've changed the, I changed the language to Swedish. Since we've changed the main function and run app, and hot reload doesn't really take changes from main function, we have to do a hot restart. So I'm going to do that now. Hot restart. Okay. And the application is up and running. So no errors, at least. That's really good. Let's go ahead and add a column to our home page. And this column is going to be used to display our information vertically. So first is going to be the breadcrumbs widget. Then there is going to be two buttons, one the add and the other one for reset. Okay, as we saw here. So the root component here is a column. So let's go ahead and to our home page, and the code is right here. And for the body, we're just going to add a column with empty children. So let's do that. Let's say body is a column, and is children is just an empty const array for now, or list. All right. Perfect. That's done. So what we need then is to create a little a call to action, which is for add button, as you saw in here. So this is what we're trying to achieve, add new breadcrumb. Okay, let's go ahead and add that in here. So remove the constant, let's just say text button, and it's unpressed is empty for now. And for its child, we're just going to say the const text add new, how do we spell it? Breadcrumb with a space. Okay, add new breadcrumb, just like that. All right, and save this. Go back to our application. Now we can see that the code is the button is available right there. Now, upon pressing this button, we want to send the user to that particular route. So we need to develop this basically. So let's say in this onPress, we're going to say navigator of context. We're going to say push named, and let's just push the /new route in here. Okay, just like that. So pressing this will then send us to the material. And unfortunately, we don't have, yeah, actually I can swipe back. So that's really good because that material doesn't have any scaffold at the moment. So we also need a reset button. So let's go ahead and add that. We're going to do it after this guy. So I'm just going to copy this text button the way it is, and I'm going to paste it right after itself. And in here, I'm just going to say reset like that. Okay. So what we need in here, now this is the first time that we're actually going to use our provider so that we're integrating with our provider up in the context chain. And the way that is going to happen is with a function on our context called read. And um, so let's have a look at, I actually want to see if I need to explain that now or later. So not to go too deep right now into how read, select, and watch work in providers, not to confuse anyone at the moment, but there are various ways of actually communicating with your providers. One is using read, and that's usually used when you want to actually communicate something to the provider. So you want to say, provider, do this, like issue an actual call on your provider, for instance, call the reset function or call the add function. You usually use read, and I'll explain this a lot more later, but you usually use read inside the callbacks. For instance, a callback of a text button. This is a perfect example where you want to use read on your provider. And we will talk then later about the rest of the properties. So let's go ahead in here and say context. I'm going to say read, and let's read our provider type in here. So let's just say breadcrumb provider, something like that. And then in here, there is a function, you see, because this then returns the provider. So if I say provider, and you can see it says provider now is of type breadcrumb provider. So this is how you get access to your provider up the ladder, okay? And then we're gonna issue the reset function on it, because remember, we actually developed this reset function in here. So this is how we are communicating to the provider. Okay, so we're using reading here, but there are many different ways of communicating with your provider, and they actually affect the way that your application works, and they affect the way that your widgets get rebuilt. And as I say, I really, really suggest that you go inside these functions and see how they work, okay? So if you go into read, you can see that it's internally using something called provider of, and then a very key parameter called listen is set to false. And you may have guessed it, since our provider is a change notifier, it can have like a stream of changes that happen over time. So it doesn't necessarily, as soon as one change, like as soon as you add one breadcrumb to it, it's not just going to immediately say, okay, I'm done. So it is continuously going to evolve. Things are going to change inside it. Things are going to mutate inside a provider. And by using read, you can see that provider library is saying that, okay, you just want to get a snapshot of that provider at this point in time, and you don't want to know about any changes that might happen to it in the future. Okay, so this in turn means that, hey, I just want to get a copy of my provider and do something with it. And I highly suggest that you don't use read if you, for instance, are expecting a immutable value to affect your UI. So don't ever just say read something from the provider and display it in a text widget, because if that value then changes inside your provider, your text widget is not going to change. So use read for communication, one-way communication, usually from your callbacks, such as the onPress callback, or for instance, if you have a tap detector, gesture detector, to then communicate with your provider. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, now we're actually going to go a little bit deeper into these things. So you can see, as I've mentioned here, we need breadcrumbs widget using a class called consumer. And I can't really explain how consumer works without going deeper into provider. And this part of the chapter is going to be a lot of me just talking and telling you about how provider needs to be used and various ways of actually communicating with your provider. And I mean, to be honest with you, I know it's a lot of talk, but it's so important. It is so important to get these things like just really down and make sure that you understand them before we continue with the rest of the chapter, okay? So we're going to go in deep and talk a little bit about 4 things: select, read, watch, and provider of, two of which you've seen already: read and provider of. you've already seen these two. So 2 out of 4 you've already seen at least, and read, you kind of know how it works, but I want to go more into detail about them soon. So let's talk about context select. So you can see here, there is a function called context select, and there is really good documentation about it. I'm going to actually leave the documentation there as I'm talking about it. So context select allows you to watch specific changes inside your provider. At the moment, the provider that we've created is very simple. It just has a list of breadcrumbs, and it doesn't have so much logic in it. It just adds stuff to it, and it can reset the entire list. However, in a real application and in a real situation, you probably have providers that are doing a lot of things. They may be doing like API calls, holding onto different states, and depending on what's inside the what's inside the provider and what you're interested in specific parts of your widgets, you may not want to watch changes to the entire provider. You may actually be interested in watching changes to specific things inside the provider. So if there are 10 things changing in the provider, using select, you can actually cherry pick those changes. So you can say, I'm only interested in aspect 1 or aspect 2. And remember, this is very similar to inherited model. We talked about inherited model in one of the chapters. I explained inherited model quite extensively in that chapter. So if you're interested in that, I actually suggest you go and watch that chapter, because select is kind of working like inherited model in that case. So go and watch that chapter. I think it's going to be really helpful for you. Let's go ahead and have a look at the source code for select. So let's go here. And you can see in here, you can see it says, first it gets the inherited element. And if it can't find it, then it's going to say provider null exception. And in here, let's see, if it's not null, it goes and says dependent on inherited element. So it is actually using inherited elements. And let's see, it does a deep collection equality. So this is really cool. It is really just doing like equality check between the values that were before in the provider and the values that it has just emitted. So then it means that the object that you're watching, the object that you're selecting inside your provider has to have proper equality implementation. So it means that its equal operator should be implemented properly, so that provider package can understand whether the previous object that was emitted by your provider is the same as the new one or not. Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, context select, it actually looks for specific, changes that you say in your and we'll look at the code, so don't worry about it if it's a little bit abstract. So it looks for specific changes that you specify in your provider, and then it actually marks your widget as needing to be rebuilt. So this is like the power of provider, in that inside like the build function of your widgets, you could literally say, hey, select this aspect of this provider, and then you don't do any set state or anything. If that aspect changes, then your widget will be rebuilt. So it is really, really powerful. Now there are some rules on how to use select, and it's only useful inside the build function of your widgets. Changes to the selected value will mark the widget as needing to be rebuilt. And by that, I mean, as you saw in here, I said one of the rules for read is that it should ideally be used only inside callbacks. For instance, the onPressed of a text button, for you to communicate with your provider. Select is, however, it kind of needs to be used inside build functions, such as up here. That's how I would usually use select. So don't try not to use select inside callbacks like this, because that's not the way to do it. Okay. So as we talked about it, as we actually looked at the source code, it's doing equality checks. So only if the given aspect that you provide inside your select, so actually look at it, maybe confused about aspect in here. So if we say context select, and in here we say breadcrumb provider, this will actually be your provider in here, then you may be asking for like aspect 1 in here. And this will actually give you back that aspect 1. And then if that aspect 1 changes, then it will rebuild your widget. And don't worry about it. We'll have a look at real examples soon. So when the provider emits an update, in this case, we have a change notifier, meaning that anything that happens to this breadcrumb list, when that changes, like if an add function is called or a reset function is called, if anything happens to this change notifier, meaning that when we call notify listeners, all selectors of the provider will actually be called. Okay. And don't worry. I mean, I understand. As you can see, I've written here only if the return value is different from the previous return value. So these selectors that you provide to select are going to be called. And if the previous value is different from the new value, then you will get that new value and your widget will be rebuilt, as you'll soon see. So that's for select. We've already talked about context read, but I'll reiterate just quickly. So as I've written at the bottom of the screen, this is more for you to interact with your provider. So whereas select is something for you to grab the values that are changing inside your provider, select is more for you to say, hey, provider, do this or perform this operation, okay? So we've already looked at the source code for select, but we're gonna, for read, but let's do it one more time in here. You can see that it's using provider of and is saying, okay, this, and then listen false. All right. So that's simply the source code. And we've already talked about it, that read shouldn't really be used inside the build function. And you may be saying, well, this read is inside a build function because, well, higher up, there's a build function. Well, yes, of course. But if you think like that, almost everything in Flutter is in a build function, almost. So that's not the point. The point is that this read shouldn't really be, for instance, here inside your build function. So it should usually be where you want to communicate something with your provider. And that usually is inside a callback, such as an API got downloaded and you want to send something then to your provider, or a button was pressed, or the user tapped on an image, etc. So that's where you want to use read. So, and that's, yeah, you should just mainly use it inside your event handlers. And read internally uses provider of, as we saw the source code for it, and it doesn't listen to any changes that happen to the provider. So it kind of gets a snapshot of your provider at that point in time. Now let's talk about my favorite, and that is Context Watch. And Context Watch allows you to watch changes and listen to changes that happens to your provider or your change notifier, basically, and ValueNotifier, of course, that for that matter. And whereas select allowed you to look at specific changes inside your provider, watch allows you to watch any changes that happen inside your provider. So let's go ahead and, as this tradition kind of, let's have a look at the code for watch. I'm going to put just like that. And you can see inside, it's literally just saying watch the provider of the current type. So there's no listen or anything in here. And if we go to the source code for of, let's go in there, and you can see that the default value for listen is true. That is why I always suggest developers to go and have a look at a source code where it's available. And a lot of frameworks, unfortunately, there's the possibility of having a look at a source code is not there, because the source code may be just inside a library or something. But here in Flutter, especially using like a packages, third-party packages provider, you have this ability to go into the source code and have a look at how it's built. So you'll learn a lot by doing that. So by doing watch, you're implicitly telling provider that I'm listening to any changes that are happening inside this particular provider. So context watch will mark your widget as needing to be built if the provider changes, whereas context select marks your widget needing to be rebuilt if that particular change that you're looking for has actually changed since, or the value has changed since last time you received that. So Context Watch allows you to also listen for optional providers up the chain. So that means that you're allowed to, for instance, say, if this kind of provider exists up the chain, I'm interested in its changes. So it's not going to cause any crashes in your application if that particular provider doesn't exist, for instance. So we looked at the code. Context watch is the same as provider of, and the listen property is true by default inside provider of, and that's why context watch doesn't have to provide that value. So as you can see, context watch should only be used inside build functions of stateless widget and the build function of your state object for stateful widget. So it's kind of like select. So don't use watch inside your callbacks. Don't use select inside your callbacks either. In callbacks, you want to use read. And that's how you get a snapshot, because a callback usually is kind of like synchronous, and then you just want to get a snapshot, just use read. But in your build functions, for instance, here we have a stateless widget. If you want this stateless widget to be rebuilt, then you want to basically provide or use select or watch in those cases. If you're outside the build function and you basically don't want to use a little bit of a hack and like taking advantage of like implementation details inside provider developers themselves actually suggest that you use, if you're outside the build function, then use the provider of the function itself. Although watch uses provider of, but it's recommended that you don't use watch outside the build function. If you're doing that, if you're outside the build function and you need your provider, then just use provider of, just to be explicit, saying that, yeah, I understand I shouldn't be using watch outside the build function. Okay. So with all that said, we also need to talk about a little guy here called consumer. So a consumer is a type of a provider that has a build function, kind of has a builder. So let's have a look at that. So in here, let's say final consumer blah, and let's go into consumer, and you can see that. Let's have a look at the comment or the documentation for this guy, because I think it's very important to read documentation as well. Oh my God. So it says obtains provider T from its ancestors and passes its value to builder. So the consumer widget doesn't do any fancy work. It just calls provider of in a new widget and delegates its build implementation to the builder. So that's basically the source code. Really, I advise you to have a look at how consumer really works. It's so simple. You can see in here as it was suggested. All it does in its function, like the widget, as you can see, final widget function. Okay, I actually don't understand what that is doing. Let's have a look. Build a widget tree based on the value from provider. Okay, and it shouldn't be null. Okay, and then build with child inside. It's actually calling that builder. Okay, right here. So as you can see, as the documentation is using provider of. So it's really just wrapping itself around a widget of type widget here called child, and making sure that a specific provider is available in that build context, kind of. So as you can see, consumer creates a new widget and calls the builder with its own build context. It also wraps itself around the return widget from the builder. So it's really useful. I mean, you'll actually see when we're going to use consumer. It's really useful when you don't have access to a provider, because it's just being created in the current context, and that context, which then is going to be available down the line, won't have the provider. So it's kind of like a situation where you're creating the provider, but the widgets down the tree don't have it yet. So, and here's the information. If the widget returned from the builder depends on the provider before the context itself has access to it. And don't worry, I know it's a little bit strange maybe to just think about it, but I'll show you a scenario where it's actually useful. Okay. So child of the consumer, consumer has a child widget that doesn't get rebuilt when the provider changes. And this is really, really important, because you see in here, we're giving it a child here, and then the builder also returns a widget. This builder guy is actually going to be called every time the provider changes its values or something internally changes in the provider. However, the child that is provided in here won't. So this is really useful if you are creating a provider that is kind of sitting really high up in the hierarchy, and this provider has some very key stuff, some key states that your application needs. However, these state changes don't necessarily have to rebuild the entire widget tree. So let's say you have a whole like sidebar, you have nav bars, you have tab bars at the bottom of the screen, you have like buttons lying around, and only like 2 things in your entire UI may need to change when things change in your provider. You could put the entire app hierarchy almost inside the child and have that builder only build those 2 widgets. Let's say we're making things up, those 2 widgets that actually do depend on your provider's values changing. So as you can see in here inside, let's have a look in here. You see this builder guy actually gets past the child. So you build the child and pass it to your consumer, and then the consumer passes it back to you inside the builder and say, hey, what do you want to do with it? So because otherwise, if you don't get access to that child in the builder, then you can't actually build your application because the child is completely separate. And how are you going to insert your UI components in that child if it's completely separate from the rest of the builder? And that's why you get past the child inside the builder. Okay. So I know it was a lot of information. It was a lot of abstract information as well. But with all of that said, we now have enough tools in our toolkit to actually build the functionality of our application. And we're going to start doing that by using a consumer. If we go back here to our main Dart file, you'll see that we have our, let's see actually which components we have right here. You can see we have our text button in here, but we don't have any widgets that represent basically our breadcrumbs. And we talked about consumer, and what consumer is going to do is to provide you with a basically building block that will rebuild your widget whenever your change notifier notifies the consumer that something has changed. And remember, the change notifier is our provider in here. So we have our, let's have a look in here, the breadcrumb provider, and we're going to wrap this breadcrumb provider inside a consumer. And for every change that happens inside the breadcrumb provider, this consumer is going to call the builder function and allow us to create a new instance of our breadcrumbs widget, which is stateless. So the breadcrumbs widget has no way of redrawing itself at the moment. Okay. So we're going to basically create a consumer in here. Let's go ahead and do that. And let's go as the first child of this column in here, create a little our consumer, and it consumes our breadcrumbs provider. Breadcrumb provider in here, and we're going to say here's the builder, and the builder has a special signature. Let's see, it looks like this, and as you can see, it says, okay, here's the builder function. It has a context, it has a value, and the value is in fact your provider. And then it has a child. So if I type in here value, let's see, it says, okay, the value is in fact the breadcrumb provider. And the child is this little widget, which is optional. As you remember, or if you remember, I mentioned that consumers can be provided with a child widget, and this child widget will survive the rebuilds of the consumer, meaning that the child widget will in fact be a widget that can withstand changes to your provider, and you can use it in your view or in your widget hierarchy so that it doesn't get rebuilt whenever the provider changes. Okay, so let's go in here and return our breadcrumbs widget, and it says breadcrumbs, and in here we're going to say value.items, and that's like our, let's see, haven't we defined our items? Unmodifiable list view. Oh, it's called item. We perhaps have to go and rename that to items. So let's go ahead and here just change it to items. Okay, let's see if the rename is going to be successful. Otherwise, we have to do it by hand. and it's successful. I'm going to put a little comma in there. Okay. So let's bring our simulator up and see how it actually looks like. So this is our application right now, I believe. Yes, that's provider course. So this is our app at the moment, but there's no breadcrumbs displayed on the screen right now. And that is simply because we have to develop this screen, because at the moment, if you remember, we're pushing a material. So let's go ahead and change it so that we can have a completely new scaffold in here that can push stuff to the breadcrumbs provider. Okay. So we're going to create it as a stateful widget. So I'm going to get rid of the simulator in there, and let's go ahead and create a new STF, which is stateful here. And we're going to call it new breadcrumb widget, like this. Okay. So this guy, what is going to do is going to have a text field in there. So if you go back to the completed application, it's going to look like this. It has a text field, so it has a tooltip or a tip text in here that says enter a new breadcrumb here, and it of course is also going to have a text editing controller, which allows us to extract the text of the text field when you press the add button in here. So it's very simple. By pressing the add button, we're also going to get read our provider. Remember, we're going to say context read, and then we're going to extract our provider. And then we're going to invoke the add function on our provider, which we've coded right here. After doing the add, and the screen is also going to pop back to the previous one, which is our home page. So that's what we're going to do in this section of the chapter. So you may be thinking, okay, but how is this screen going to get our provider, since it's a completely new scaffold and it has no access to the provider otherwise? But what you need to remember is the build context. Again, build context in Flutter is so important that I think any developer has to spend a lot of time understanding how build context actually works and why it's so important. Remember, when we created this ChangeNotifier provider, this ChangeNotifier provider at the moment is wrapping itself around the entire application, meaning that the creation of this provider will actually be provided. The creation of this will cause the provider to be available in all build context, essentially in the entire application, meaning that if I then push a new screen to the user and I say, here's a completely new screen, has its own scaffold, the build context of that scaffold will also, inside the build function, will have access to this provider if you just say context read or a context select or watch. And so this is why build context is so important. It is a way for you to do dependency injection, basically. It's kind of invisible dependency injection in Flutter. So what we need is to go to our new screen and add a text editing controller, because we're going to need that in order to grab our the text of our text field. So I'm just going to go and add that. So let's say late final text editing controller, and let's just call it controller with an underscore. Okay. So inside, excuse me, inside init state in here, we're going to instantiate this text editing controller. So I'm just going to say init state, and let's go ahead and say controller is text editing controller. Yeah, that's fine. And we also shouldn't forget about disposing of it when the widget gets disposed. So let's just say dispose, and it's going to overwrite it for me. And then I'm going to say controller dispose, just like that. Okay. I'm also going to go to my notes to ensure that I haven't really missed anything in here. Okay. So this is dispose, just like that. But let's go ahead in here in the build function of our new widget, create a little scaffold. So let's say scaffold, and then we say app bar, like this. And this is an app bar, and its title, we're going to say const text. And in here, say add new breadcrumb, like that. Okay. So I'm going to save that, and let's have a look at our application now and see how it looks like. Add a new breadcrumb. Oh, it still doesn't work because we have to do a hot restart perhaps. So I'm going to do a hot restart in here. Let's see if it works. Poof. How do we do hot restart with the keyboard? Oh, like that. Oh yeah, because we're still returning material. So remember that we're still returning that material on top of the screen. So we are going to change that soon. So we can't see the screen right now. We just have to program it without actually seeing how it looks like. Okay. But since the UI is very simple, I don't think we actually have to look at the simulator or emulator or an actual device to see, oh yeah, it's working fine, because it's just so simple. So let's go ahead in here. We have the app bar. What we need is to create a simple column in here in our in the body of our scaffold, and add our text field, and also add a button. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that right after app bar. We're going to say the body is a column with children like this. Can't see the code really, but yeah. So in here, we're going to add our text field in here. So let's just say text field. Its controller is going to be our little controller here, and its decoration is going to be a const input decoration. Okay. And the input decoration's hint text is, we decided to say enter a new breadcrumb here, like that. Okay. So that's going to be the first child of this column. So the code's gonna look like this, and I'm missing a comma in here. I'm gonna add that. Okay. So that's for the text field. Now let's go ahead, and we also need a button, which is our call to action, or CTA as it's sometimes also called. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm going to add a text button in here. Okay. And this guy needs unpressed, which is a parameter with a void callback basically, and a child. The child in here, we're going to add a simple text. It's going to say const text add, just like that. Okay. So, and then inside the unpressed, then we have to actually handle the action. So what is really going to happen is that we're going to use read of our context. And remember, read is doing a provider of, and it's not listening. And I mentioned it many times that read is perfect for being called inside your callbacks, or these completion handlers, or void callbacks, for instance, in these blocks. So let's go ahead and actually do that. But remember, actually, no, we have imported provider, so there's nothing to remember. So let's just say read, then we're going to grab a breadcrumb provider, okay? And then we're just going to say add. So we actually have to create a new breadcrumb. So let's say final breadcrumb is equal to. So let's grab our text in here. Final text is controller.text. And then we're going to say if text is not empty, then we're going to add a breadcrumb. Okay. So let's go in here, and then we say we create a new instance of breadcrumb, and is active is going to be false by default in here, and its name is going to be the text. Okay. Like this. And then we're adding it, and we shouldn't really forget to pop out of the screen once we're done. So let's say a navigator of context, and then we're just going to say pop. We're not going to give it any values to pop back, okay? Because our application is using a provider, and we don't have to pass values between screens. And this is one of the beauties of using a state management system in Flutter, in that you don't have to pass values between screens. Okay, so that's that part. What we need now is to be able to go to that screen instead of actually going to material. So let's go to top of the screen in here, and in the main function inside run app, we are at the moment, we've defined this new route in here, and we're pushing material. And instead, what we're going to do is to actually return an instance of our new breadcrumb widget. So let's just say new breadcrumb widget, just like that. And it's a constant. Oh, fantastic. And that was really it. We're done now with this widget. So we're kind of done with the entire application, to be honest. So there's not much more to it. We're literally adding and then resetting. And let's have a look at the reset actually, and see if we program that. So reset, yes, it's calling reset. So it's really time now to have a look at our application and make sure that it's working fine. I'm going to do a hot restart as well to make sure that the changes to the main function are taking effect as well. Remember, hot reload doesn't take into consideration changes to the main function. So let's go ahead and add a new breadcrumb, and I'm going to say 1. Okay. And you can see our breadcrumbs widget is rendering that. And then I'm going to say 2. And all of a sudden that 1 is become active and 2 is added. Then let's say 3. And that's that. And if we keep adding stuff in here, then it's going to wrap them to the next line. So let's just add them. until it goes off the screen, and then it wraps to the next. And we can also test the reset, and you can see reset's also working fine. Now, one of the things that you may want to extend upon in this example, which is something that I'm not going to do in here, is to go ahead and make those breadcrumb little widgets tappable. So the way to do that would be to go to your breadcrumbs widget, which you can see here. And here, where you create a text for every one of these breadcrumbs, you would want to wrap this around with a gesture detector. So let's just say gesture detector. And in here on tap, you would then have the ability to grab that breadcrumb, which you have in here, and perhaps call a little callback. You could actually expect a little callback in here. For instance, we could say type alias or type def, sorry. Type def on breadcrumb tapped. It would be a void function that takes in a breadcrumb just like that. And then you would actually expect that in here, you'd say on tapped, okay? And you would add it to your constructor, add final formal fields in here, and then you'd make it required, okay? And then the rest is history. So you're just gonna call this callback, then you would just say on tapped breadcrumb, and that's it, really, not much more to it. And so I'm not going to do that in this example, though. I just wanted to give you the idea that you can basically build on top of this example that we built today and make it more advanced, and just experiment a little bit with it. Experiment with a provider if you can. Great stuff. As we usually do, let's go ahead and commit and tag our code. So I'm going to say git init and then git add all, git commit step 1. Okay. And we're also going to say git tag step 1. Okay. And if you look at our tags, step 1 is there. And if you look at our logs, step 1 is there. Fantastic. So I mean, this example was great. It showed you how to use read, and it showed you how to use consumer. However, there is so much more into provider than just consumer and read. And what we're going to do is to create now a completely new application that is in detail going to demonstrate how to use select, read, and watch, because these are so powerful, especially select and watch, in that you don't even have to wrap your objects or wrap your widgets inside any consumer. You could literally say, this is my normal widget, and it's using, and it is, for instance, just using select. And that widget will be rebuilt if that particular aspect of your provider changes. So there's a lot to talk about. And I don't think that we can use this current example to demonstrate all of that. So what we're going to do is to close this project and go ahead and create a completely new one and use that test bed to have a look at how providers select, watch, and read work. Okay. So we're going to create a little example for this, and it's going to be called details of provider. So how it's going to work is, I'm going to bring it here, details of provider. As you can see here, it kind of looks like this. It doesn't look at all interesting, but it really demonstrates important concepts of the application, of provider. So how this application at the moment is working is that it's hooked into one provider, just a provider. And this provider is exposing two separate properties that change over time. One is something that it calls a cheap widget. The other one, it's called an expensive widget. So what this provider at the moment is holding on to is two date properties, as you can see in here. One changes every second, and the other one changes every minute, I believe. Just to demonstrate that, for instance, a widget that is called cheap widget, meaning that it is cheap in its creation, it doesn't take so many resources, it can be updated every second. However, a more expensive widget, which for instance could be your scaffold, it could be a very complex UI hierarchy, it doesn't need to be updated every second or every time this particular property changes. So in this guy, we're using in actually both the cheap widget and expensive widget, we're going to use select. So we have a little provider on top, and it's containing two properties. One is a cheap timestamp, and the other one is an expensive timestamp. And these two are hooking themselves into that provider and saying that whenever this property changes using select, I'm interested in redrawing myself. And the expensive one is also saying, yeah, I'm also interested in the expensive one, expensive timestamp, and I'm going to also redraw myself. Okay. So those are those two widgets. So they're hooking themselves to our provider using context.select. However, here we have a third widget, and what this guy is doing is using watch, and this guy is being updated anytime anything changes inside our provider. So it's not really using a consumer as such, but these two on top are using select, and this thing at the bottom is using watch. And then we have two buttons in here, stop. As you can see, the entire provider stops emitting values. And then we have another one that is called start. So these two buttons, since they're text buttons, and we talked about text buttons before in the previous example, they're then communicating with our provider using read. So in this example, we're going to use select for those top two. For the middle one with this widgets in here, we're going to use watch. And for these two buttons, we're going to use read. So you're going to then get acquainted with how to use these three very important aspects of provider package in Flutter using this example, okay? So yeah, I've talked about these already. One is a cheap widget, and it's using select to render a container that renders itself when a part of the provider changes. The other one's more expensive. It's also using select. However, it's watching another aspect of the provider. And the third one is using watch, okay? And then we have the start and stop, which are the two buttons. So I kind of like ran ahead of myself and explained all of this without actually showing the captions. So let's go ahead and send this guy to the background. And I'm going to stop running this application and close Visual Studio Code in there. And let's go ahead and see if we can bring up a terminal window. And let's go to the right project. So CD. Let's see if I can actually get this to work. CD. I believe I have here Flutter state management. Okay. So let's go ahead in here and just say Flutter create details of provider course. And I'd like to add an organization in here, SE Pixelity. Okay. Perfect. And that is going to create that project for us. And let's go ahead and say CD details of provider course. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code in here. Great stuff. So let's go to our main application in here, main Dart. Okay. So what we're going to do in here is we are going to use two packages in this application, and they're going to be provider, of course, and then we're also going to use a package called UUID. And this UUID is going to allow us to identify our provider for any widget that is consuming it, so that that widget knows that something has happened in this provider, okay? So let's go ahead and add these one by one. So what we're going to do first is to Flutter pub add provider. I'm going to open up terminal in here, and let's just say Flutter pub add provider. And then we could also say Flutter pub add UUID, because we need that as well. So let's say Flutter pub add UUID. Both these packages are third-party packages, so they're nothing that is provided by the Flutter community, or it's provided by, for instance, an official Google source. So just so you know. So let's go ahead and create a basic scaffold in here. And I have that already prepared with a snippet, and I have a actual YouTube video about how to create such snippets. So search for that online inside my channel, and you'll find that. So now we have a simple material app in here with a main function and run app, and a simple homepage with a scaffold. So let's go ahead in here and import three things. We need UID provider, and we also need Dart async. So let's say import Dart async and import package, and this is going to be provider, I believe. And let's import also package UUID, just like that. So now we have all three imports ready to go. Okay, so as we talked about this before, actually, I'm going to open up my details of provider in here as well, project, so I have it ready. So you saw that we have these cheap and expensive widgets. Let's go back to this example. And these two are hooked into two particular objects. And one is called a cheap object, and the other one is called an expensive object. So these objects will allow us to identify them up the hierarchy. So you may be wondering, like, okay, but how is it that we need separate objects? Couldn't the provider just store strings? Well, it kind of could actually, but it is a lot easier to demonstrate how select actually works if you go ahead and say that a provider contains two objects. One is of type cheap object, and the other one is of type expensive object. And when I do select, I can expect select function to return an instance of cheap object, okay? Rather than having two timestamps. And in both cases, you're selecting only a timestamp by using its just property name. You'll soon see. So it makes it a little bit more explicit in the definition or the writing of the select statement, what aspect of your provider you're looking for, okay? So let's go ahead and we're going to implement these objects soon, actually. So let's go create a base class for these two because they're very similar to each other. They both have UUIDs and they both are going to contain a last updated date. So they have, I mean, their goal is the same. They just contain a date and timestamp of type string in this case, but so they don't have their own logic as such. So what we're going to do is to create a base class for both of them, and then we're going to extend this base class into the cheap object and the expensive object. Okay. So let's go ahead and create this little base class in here. I'm going to call it immutable as well, and actually not going to call it immutable. I'm going to mark it as immutable. And let's say it's called base object, just like that. Okay. So it will have two properties. One is its ID, just to identify it to the provider that if anything has changed in it. Although you could use the date and time also as an ID, but I kind of like as a preference to use UUID for that. It's a little bit more scientific. And let's go ahead and add these two properties. So one is the ID and the other one is the actual timestamp, okay? So let's add those two properties in here. I'm going to say final string, and it's going to be its ID, and then final string last updated, okay? So let's create the constructor for this guy. Create constructor like that, okay? And by default, it really doesn't take any parameters. So the constructor will create its own ID and will grab the current time as now, basically. So let's go ahead in here and initialize the ID, and we're going to say const UID like this, and v4 like that. And we're also going to set the last updated to date time dot now, and we're going to get the ISO string just like that. Perfect. So this creates our base objects constructor for us. Okay. So I mean, we're going to use select, so we need the identity in this object, and that's what I mentioned. You could use last updated, to be honest with you, but ID is a little bit more like comforting because you're basically identifying this object. Do you want to really identify it with last updated? What if you add more properties to this object? How are you going to identify that? Are you going to then take like some sort of a combination of those properties and like identify with them? It's just a lot easier to use one field, and that's why we're using ID in this example, okay? Since we're using select and we're looking for the ID, we kind of need this object to be equatable. So we need this object to be able to emit true or false, whether it's equal to another object or not. So for that, we need to implement our equal operator. So I'm just going to go in here and say override bool operator equal, and covariant of base object other. And in here, we're just going to say ID is equal to other ID. That's it. Okay. So that was the equality, but as you can see, we also have to implement hash code. I'm going to get help from Visual Studio Code to define that hash code for us, at least the skeleton for it. And for this, I'm going to use the ID's hash code. Okay, so very simple. So now that the base object is done, let's go ahead and define a class that holds on to our expensive object. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and say immutable, and let's say class expensive object extends base object. Okay, so it's not more complex than that. It's just adding an expensive object in here. And while that is going on, I'm going to actually run this application so that we don't have to wait for build later on, and let it just do its work. Now that we've created the expensive object, which holds on to an identifier and also it holds on to the last updated timestamp, we need a similar one for cheap object. So let's go ahead and copy this code that we written here. And instead of expensive object in here, we're just going to say cheap object. Okay, just like that. Okay, now that we've done that, let me actually get rid of this widget inspector in here for now. And I can see our application running here. We have a homepage and a simple scaffold, so there's not much more to it. So now that we have the cheap object and the expensive object, we need to work on our provider. And this provider is going to have three main properties, really, and actually five, but three main properties. And these three properties are the identifier of the provider, and the other two are going to be references to the cheap object and the expensive object. But remember, we will also have a start and stop on our provider. So this start and stop function, these start and stop functions are gonna create some sort of a stream subscription and are gonna go into a stream of periodic. And for the cheap object, we're going to kick off a stream that every second updates the cheap object. And for the expensive one, we're going to kick it off so that it starts, basically, it kicks every once in a minute or once a minute, basically. So, and we want our provider to be a change notifier. As I mentioned before, and I've actually explained ChangeNotifier and ValueNotifier in previous chapters in this course. So if you look them up inside the playlist that is linked at the bottom of this description section, you'll know that we've talked about ChangeNotifier and ValueNotifier quite a lot before. So I'm not going to explain it. But in this particular example, since our provider is going to have a few properties that are changing over time, we are not only holding on to one value, meaning that we're not going to be a value notifier, but we're also holding on to a set of changes, meaning that we're going to use a change notifier. So remember, a provider can be a value notifier or change notifier, anything that's listenable, okay? So let's go ahead and start writing our provider class. And in here, let's just go ahead and say class object provider, okay, extends change notifier, just like that. So that's the definition of our provider. So we're going to have also two streams, as I mentioned. One is for the cheap object and the other one is for the expensive object. So these streams are going to be started inside the provider itself. So we don't actually have to start them when we start the entire application. Because if you go back to our example that we had finished already, and I'm going to kill that application and then go to details of provider, you see, as soon as the application runs, these streams are already started. So our provider is going to have these stream subscriptions and hold on to them and also start them as soon as the application starts, okay? So let's go ahead first and add an identifier to our provider in here. So I'm going to say late string ID. So we're going to set this identifier soon, okay? And we're also going to hold on to a reference to our cheap object in here. So I'm just going to say late cheap object, a cheap object like that. And we need also a stream subscription because we're going to kick off a periodic stream that changes the cheap object. So that's going to be a cheap stream, a stream subscription that we can close whenever the stop button is tapped. So let's say stream subscription, cheap object stream subs, something like that, okay? And we also need similar to these, but for the expensive object. So I'm just gonna copy these and say expensive object, okay? Actually, I'm running a little bit ahead of myself. I've prepared like titles for these things. So let's go ahead. So we've created this a cheap object stream subs in here. Okay, so that's done. We need to also hold on to the expensive object. So let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to say expensive object in here and then expensive object, something like that. Okay. Of course, we need a stream subscription for the expensive object as well. So let's say expensive object stream subs. Okay. So since these are, let's make this cheap object underscore. So they're private. Since these are private fields and we're not, we don't want the outside world to be able to like really change these, we're going to create some getters for them. Okay, so let's go ahead and say cheap object get, and it's called cheap object, and we're just going to expose our cheap object in here using the syntax. Excuse me. Similar to the cheap object, we're going to also expose the expensive object. So it's going to be expensive object in here. Get expensive object, and it's going to return our expensive object. Okay, so oh, it's called expensive object like that. All right, so now we have our fields in here, and then we also have two public getters that access those fields that are otherwise private. Okay, so we need a little function that kicks off the stream. So we need to start implementing this start function. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a void start in here. And in the start, what we're going to do is to first create two streams. Okay, let's say the cheap object subscription stream subs is equal to a stream, and we're going to say periodic. And remember, the cheap object needs to change every second. So the period is a constant duration of seconds 1. Okay, like that. So that's the first parameter. And that's the periodic one. So we're not going to do anything in there. But what we're going to do is, as you can see, we're getting an error saying that seconds is not defined. Oh, here. The value of stream dynamic can't be assigned to the stream subscription because we're not actually subscribing to the stream. We're just creating it. So let's just subscribe to it. Let's just say, I'm going to put a comma in there. And then we're going to say listen. Okay. And then we get the event in there. We're pretty much going to ignore the event. So let's just ignore the event right there. And inside the listener in here, we're going to assign a new instance of our cheap object to the cheap object property. So every second, we're replacing this cheap object with a new one. So this could be similar to you, for instance, making an API call or something and storing the result inside the property, inside your provider. So it's not any different. I'm just trying to demonstrate how changing things inside a provider will then be able to propagate down to your widget tree or your element tree. After we do that, it's your responsibility to notify anyone who's listening to your change notifier, to notify anybody who's listening to your provider. So you have to call notify listeners, okay? And similar to this, we're going to get the expensive stream sub. And here we're going to say duration is going to be, let's just say every 10 seconds. So we don't have to wait a whole minute, okay? So in here, we're going to replace the expensive object with an instance of expensive object like that. All right. And of course, we're also going to notify our listeners. So that's pretty much it. That's really it for the start function. There's not much more code to it. However, after doing the start, we also need to work on stop. So we have the stream subscriptions. Let's go and create a void stop in here. And inside stop, all we're going to do is to cancel our stream subscription. So let's say stream subs for the cheap one, and we're going to cancel it. And for the expensive stream subs, cancel that as well. So these are going to be the two functions that our buttons are going to call and interact with our provider in that way. Okay. Excuse me. So we also need to have a little constructor for our for our provider, because there are a few properties in here that we said that are late, as you can see in here. Like this one we're going to ignore for now, this one we're going to ignore for now, and actually not for now. These are going to be ignored because these are going to be created inside the start function. I don't know why I stuttered so long. So let's go ahead and create the constructor for this class. So let's go ahead and say object provider. This is our constructor. The ID is going to be a const UID, and we're going to get the v4 in here. And let's go ahead then and say that our cheap object, we initialize it to a cheap object instance in here, okay? And then we're also going to say the expensive object is an instance of expensive, if I can spell, object, just like that. So now we have the constructor for our object provider as well. So perfect. So what we need to do is to actually do something tricky in here. You see, in this example, in this particular example, let's go ahead and have a look in here. In the simulator in here, you could see that this guy is using watch, is watching the provider, okay? Now, how should this guy know that the provider actually has changed? How should watch know that this is not the same provider as it was before? What we're going to do is anytime this notify listeners function is called, we're going to reset this ID to a new ID. So this object provider is actually changing its identifier every time something has to be notified. So every time this notify listeners function gets called, we're going to reset the ID of our provider so that watch later on can know that, hey, the provider actually changed, its identifier has changed, okay? So let's go ahead and override this notify listeners function in here. Let's go ahead and see if Visual Studio Code can help us notify listeners, and it can't. So let's say override void notify listeners like this. And in here, inside notify listeners, we're going to say ID is const UID v4, just like that. And then we're going to call super notify listener. So this is a little trick that I like to use in my providers if I need to actually update something fundamental with the provider itself before super notify listener is called, okay? So now that we've created our provider, I mean, the provider itself is completely done. I'm going to actually do a hot restart in here. Let's see if we can go back to our application. Hot restart kicked in. What we're going to do is to do something basically pretty much the same thing that we did in the beginning of this chapter, to change our main function in here so that we can create our provider, okay? So we're going to go and say we have a ChangeNotifierProvider instead of the material app in here, or not instead of, actually as a wrapper around it. So let's wrap the material app with ChangeNotifierProvider in here. And then we, of course, have to implement the create function. We ignore the context. We don't need it. And in here, we create an instance of our object provider. So we're going to say const. Actually, it's not a const. So let's say object provider. Like that, okay? So remember, changes to the main functions aren't going to be affected by actually hot reload is not going to take changes from your main function into your app bundle. So what we have to do is to do a hot restart for these changes to take effect, okay? All right, so what we're going to do now is to go ahead and develop these two widgets. One is going to be called a cheap widget, and the other one is going to be an expensive widget. Okay, they're actually two separate widgets, but they work exactly alike. It's just to have these different colors. Basically, I just want to make it very explicit that these two could be inside your application completely different widgets, even though in this particular example they're almost the same widget. Okay. So in our application, you could just say, yeah, you could just pass a background color to that widget. I know that, but I just want to make sure that we are being very explicit about that these two widgets could potentially be completely different from each other, okay? So we're going to go ahead and create this expensive widget first. So I'm going to go at the bottom in here, and let's go ahead and let me see if I can also find my notes in here, okay? So let's go ahead and start creating the expensive widget. And this guy is going to be a stateless widget. So let's say STL for stateless, and let's call it expensive widget. Okay, so perfect. So you may be thinking, okay, in this constructor, we kind of have to have a provider, but we don't, because this expensive widget is going to be inserted inside a widget hierarchy whose build context already has access to that provider. So if we just use this build context, that provider is going to be able to be looked up the widget hierarchy to be able to be found using select, read, or watch, or just provider of. So, oops. So you don't have to worry about that. So let's go ahead and start implementing this guy. So inside of the build function, we're going to get reference to our expensive object. Okay. So let's go ahead and do that. In here, this is the first time we're actually going to use select. So it's going to be exciting. Let's say we get our final, our expensive object. Expensive object is equal to context. Now we're going to use select because you see, in this expensive widget, we're only interested in changes in the provider that affect the expensive object. Okay. Inside select, you have to provide two parameters. One is the provider type. So we're going to say object provider, and then the aspect of that provider that you're actually selecting. Okay. So we are expecting to select expensive object. And then in this function, you will have access to your provider. So in here, let's say, then we get a provider, and in here you want providers expensive object, just like that. Okay, I'm gonna put a comma in there, so maybe it's a little bit more readable for you as well. Let me go back to our application so that hot reload works. Okay. So this is the syntax for select. If you go to the function definition for the select, you'll see that it says T and R, and it requires R to be returned. You see in here? And that's what we're doing. We're returning R, which is expensive object. We're actually returning. And it says, okay, then I will give you T. If you say T, what is T in this case? It is this first parameter, object provider. So it's this provider is object provider. So if you change this to something else to say like this is a string, then okay, it thinks this provider is a string. Okay, but it's not a string in our case, of course. So now that we have that, we're watching or selecting actually our expensive object, and only if it changes, we're going to get notified about that. And you actually, before I go forward, move forward with this, I said only if it changes. What does that even mean? Well, remember, expensive object and cheap object, they both come from base object, and base object has that equality definition. Remember this guy? Every time expensive object gets replaced or cheap object gets replaced, this ID changes. And select internally, as we saw earlier in this chapter, is going to do a comparison. It's going to say, is the previous object the same as the new one? If yes, no change happened. If it's equal, equality is the key in here. Okay, so select depends on this equality. So it's very important that you actually implement equality for your objects correctly. And with that, also the hash code. Okay. So now that we've done that, here's an expensive object. We got a hold of that. And what we're going to do is to just create a little container here with the height of 100. So let's say the height is 100. Okay. And its color is going to be, because we're developing expensive widget. If you remember, expensive widget was this one, which is blue. So let's give it a color. And we're going to say color is blue. Okay. And its children are very simple. It's just three text widgets. If you look here, it says the first one says expensive widget, the second one says last updated, and the third one is actually the timestamp that comes from this expensive object. Okay, so let's go ahead inside the container. Say it has a child and with a column, and its children are these. And the first one is a const text. We're going to call it expensive widget. The second one is going to be last updated. So I'm going to copy this guy and I'm going to say last updated. Like this, okay. And then the third one is going to be a text of our expensive object last updated, okay. Last updated, perfect. So that's our expensive widget, okay. I think I'm missing some commas in here. Perfect, like that. So here's the container. It's not more difficult than that, to be honest. Okay, so that was for our expensive widgets. it's time to implement the cheap widget. And this is the cheap widget, to be honest with you, is going to be very, very similar to, sorry about that. I think I went to do not disturb me somehow and disable it. I don't know how, but this is going to be very similar to our expensive widget. It's actually identical. So it's just going to have some a few differences. So let's just develop this by hand so you'll see the differences. So STL, and we're going to say cheap widget. Okay. And this guy, just like the previous one, we have no constructors because, yeah, we're going to grab a hold of our provider using select. And we're going to get a reference to our cheap object in this case. So let's go ahead and actually, let me go to my cheap widget in here. Let's go ahead and copy this code from expensive widget and bring it in here in the build function of the cheap widget. And in here, change this to say we're looking for cheap object in the object provider, but the object itself is called cheap object. You see how now it's becoming a little bit more explicit? We're looking for a specifically cheap object, and here the compiler is helping us saying that, oh, but this is not that. So if you'd use string as last updated, you could miss things like this so easily, because if you just set string in here and you use, like, instead of the cheap objects last updated, you use the expensive objects last updated, you wouldn't get any error because string is a string. Okay, but in here we're explicitly saying that the cheap object should be of type cheap object. Okay, so just to explain a little bit more why we've developed two separate objects for these. Okay, and in here we say we're expecting cheap object to be returned. Okay, so this is going to be very similar to the expensive widgets container. So I'm going to copy that container from expensive widget and just bring it in here. Okay. So instead of expensive widget, we're going to say cheap widget. Last updated is going to stay the same. And in here, we're going to say cheap objects last updated. Okay, so in that case, I mean, in this particular scenario, cheap widget and expensive widget, they're very similar except for what they're probing from the provider, which in the cheap widget's case is cheap object, and in the expensive widget's case is expensive object. Okay, great stuff. So we can't now just go ahead and say we're done, because we have a third widget that we have to implement. And that is, if you go back to this example in here, it's this one that gets re-rendered anytime anything changes in our provider. And it's mostly interested in its ID. So it's watching that property. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and implement this widget, which we're calling object provider widget. So let's see if I can find that in my notes as well. The object provider widgets, object provider widgets. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and start implementing this object provider widget. So it's a stateless widget as well. So STL object provider widget. And remember, this is not going to use select. This guy is going to use watch. It's going to watch the entire provider. Anything that changes inside the provider, this guy is going to re-render itself. So it's going to re-render itself when the 1 second stream subscription fires, and it's going to render itself whenever the ID changes. It's going to re-render itself whenever the 10-second or the expensive stream subscription also fires. So any changes that happen to the provider are going to trigger this guy to re-render itself. Okay, so in the build function of this guy, we're going to watch the entire provider. So let's go ahead in here and say final provider is context.watch. Okay, and you'll see watch has a T in here. It says, okay, what provider do you want me to watch? And I'm going to say in here object provider. Okay, and that's it. And now this provider is your entire object provider, as you can see in here. Okay, so what we're going to do in here is to create the container. So let's go ahead and say return container. Its height is also going to be 100. So height 100. And it's very similar to these expensive and cheap widgets. So I'm going to copy that code in here and paste it right there. Height is 100. The color is going to be purple. So let's say colors.purple. Okay. And in here, we're going to say object provider widget. And it has last updated. In this case, we're going to say ID, and we're going to say provider.id. Okay, so that's how we're going to render this particular component on the screen. Okay, it's time to wrap it up. So we have to put all of this together. We have now 3 separate widgets. We have the provider, which is a change notifier. We built and we basically hooked it to our material app in the main function. We've done a lot, but we have to actually put it together and see some stuff on the screen, because at the moment our screen is completely white. Okay. So what we're going to do is to render 3 rows in here. As you'll see, this is how the application should look like. This is the first row, this is the second row, and this is the third row. Okay, so let's go ahead and create these rows. So let's go ahead in our home page. I'm going to find the home page in here, and I'm going to find also in my notes so that I don't miss giving you some important information. Let's see homepage. Okay. So let's go ahead right after app bar inside body and say the body of the scaffold is actually a column, so that it renders its children vertically on the screen. The first one is a row with the children again. Okay. And in here, we're going to render our cheap, I think a cheap widget and our expensive widget. Okay. So we're going to just add our cheap and expensive widgets in here. So let's go ahead and say children are const in the first row, and it's the cheap widget like that. And we're also going to have expensive widget, but we can't just put them in here because they don't have intrinsic widths. We just added heights for these containers. So in this guy inside row for its children, what we're going to do is to say this is expanded. Child is the cheap widget. Okay, because expanded is having a flex of 1 by default, and that makes sure that if you have 2 expanded next to each other in the same row, they're going to take in the entire available width of the screen, but they're going to divide it between themselves equally. Okay, so let's go ahead and then add the expensive widget in here as well. Okay, so if I then save this guy, let's go back to our application, and you can already see these rendered in here. I'm going to hot restart the application. Okay, so these are for expanded. So maybe I actually remove these for now so that they look a little bit nicer. And let's go, I can see both of these guys at the moment have the same, they have the same color. Okay, and they're not updating. We will fix that soon. They have the same color, but we saw that the cheap one has to be yellow. So let's go ahead in here, say yellow. And we also need to now go to our provider. In here, when we start the provider, okay, we also have to kick off the entire process. So inside our constructor, we're going to start these streams. So let's go in here and say start. Okay, I'm going to save this guy, go back to our application and do a hot restart. And now you'll see that our cheap widget is updating every second. And if we wait a little bit in here, you'll see that the expensive widget is also going to update once that 10 second has passed, as you just saw. Okay. So let's go now to the second row of our homepage. The first row is done. We've added the cheap widget and the expensive widgets. So we need to now go ahead and program the rest. So in the second row, we're just going to have one expanded widget, and that's going to be our object provider widget. So let's go ahead and add that. Row children like this is going to be a const. Okay. And we're going to just say expanded. Expanded, if I can spell, its child is going to be our object provider widget, which is going to change anytime. It's going to be re-rendered anytime anything changes inside the provider, as you can see in here. So what we're going to do now is to go ahead and add our third row in here. And the third row is going to be our buttons. Okay. So we're going to code that third row now. So let's go ahead and say this is a row. It has children, of course. That's why we use rows. Children. Okay. Unfortunately, children can't be constants because the text buttons aren't constants. Okay. So let's go in here then. And let's say the first one is going to be a text button. If you remember, I think it was a start button or stop button, as you can see in here. So let's go ahead and add a text button in here and say text button. And the text button needs an on pressed. and it also needs a child. So it's going to be a const text stop like that. And since we have the text button for stop, I'm going to copy that and go, actually, let's code it entirely. And then we're going to copy paste it for stop as well. Okay. So in here, we need to communicate to our provider and invoke the stop function on it. Remember, inside callbacks, such as this onPress callback of a text button, the right way of communicating with your provider is not through watch, is not through provider of, is not through select, is through read. Okay, so you need to say context read object provider, and in here, then you could just say stop. All right. Now that we have that, I'm going to copy paste the code for the stop button, and I'm going to say start in here. And instead of stop, I want to call start function on our provider. So now it's demo time, really. Let's have a look at this demo of our application and see how it's looking. I'm going to hot restart the application. So we can see in here, the object provider widget is watching changes to the entire provider. Anything that happens in the provider, we're going to get notified about that. And that's why we're seeing it reconstruct itself every time we call notify listeners, because the ID is changing as well. Okay. Here, the cheap widget is being updated every second. And that's simply because it's basically selecting the cheap object aspect of our objects provider. And the expensive widget is doing something similar, but it's only selecting the expensive object aspect of our object provider, and it's updating itself every 10 seconds. Okay, and that's all hooked to that stream subscription that we talked about earlier. Then in the third row, we have the stop and start buttons, and pressing stop stops the entire provider subscriptions. As you saw, it's canceling those stream subscriptions, and pressing start is going to then resume emitting values for our streams. Okay, so great stuff. We're done with this example. Well done. Let's go ahead, as is tradition. We're going to commit our code and tag it as well. So let's say git init, git add all, oops, git add a, git commit, and we're going to say step 1. And we're also going to tag it as step 1. Okay, it's always good to like commit and tag your codes, even if it's local, so you can always go back to previous steps that you've taken and kind of like learn from it or understand how the program has really evolved. I mean, I do it all the time, even if I have like local projects that I'm working with. I always make a little Git repository. The cost is very low. It's nothing that you have to worry about in terms of bytes consumed on your disk. So great stuff. We talked a lot about provider up to this point. We've talked almost 2 hours about provider, but there is a third type of provider which we need to talk about before we close off this section or this chapter about providers, because otherwise it won't be complete. So the third type of providers is something called a multi-provider. You see, at the moment, what we've done is that we've gone to the main function of our application and we created ChangeNotifier provider. Well, you'd be like, okay, but in a big application, I don't want to have one provider holding the entire state of the application. And you would be right. You wouldn't do that in a production application. So if you have many things that are happening in the background, like API calls being made, a button is pressed, you're changing the theme of the application or whatever, these things need to probably go into their own providers. And the way to inject these providers, like multiple ones, not just single one, into the build context is to use something called a multi-provider. And that's what we're going to do in this chapter. As you can see, it allows you to propagate multiple changes down in the widget hierarchy. Okay. So we need a new project. I'm not going to change the project that we've created just so that we can demonstrate how multi-provider works. So let's go ahead, since creating projects is also very cheap, let's go ahead and create a new one. So I'm going to stop this project and close it. And I'm going to send this application to the background. Let me see if I can bring up our terminal. And let's go ahead and CD into that folder again in here. And we're going to create a new application. So what I'm going to do in here, before we do that, I'm going to show you actually how this application will look like. I think it's called multi-provider in here. I'll open it up for you. And as you can see in here, let's see if it's at the moment not really emitting any values, and that's probably because I've haven't really run the application. But let me see if I can grab a hold of our multi-provider app and run it in the simulator so we can have a look at how it really looks like in the simulator. Okay, so it's running the Xcode build at the moment, I can see. But what it's really doing is that we have, oh, it's running. Okay. So you can see in here, it's very similar to what we've done before, but what it is doing really is it's not just a provider that has two properties. This, in fact, is a multi-provider that is holding onto two separate providers of type stream provider. So these stream providers are each of which emitting new values. The first one is emitting values every 1 second, and this one's emitting values every 60 seconds. And remember, although you'd be like, oh, but this is what we've already done this. No, we haven't really. What we've done in the beginning of this chapter was to create one provider that holds on to two values, each of which changes over time. In this example, what we're going to do is to have two providers, and those providers are each of which holding on to one value. And we're going to bring them together using something called a multi-provider, which is available in the provider package. And then we're going to create the widgets for them. Okay, so similar looking, but very differently constructed. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the project in here. So I'm gonna add in here, just say Flutter create a multi-provider example course, and I like to set the organization, as I mentioned before, SE Pixelity, like that. This is going to create the project for us. So let's say multi-course and open up Visual Studio Code right there. And since Visual Studio Code has a built-in terminal, we don't have to have this terminal window open. So I'm just going to open that up in here. Okay. So let's go to the main Dart file in here, and I'm going to delete all of this and just create a simple scaffold. As I've mentioned many times before, it's a very simple scaffold with a home page and just a scaffold with an app bar in here. Okay. So what we need is just a simple function in here that gets the current time for us. Okay. So let's go ahead and define this little guy in here. We're going to say it returns a string. It's called now, and it says date time now. And then we're going to get the ISO string from it. So this little function is going to give us the current date and time. Okay. So what we need then is to have, what we're going to do is to have two classes in here. One is called seconds, the other one's called minutes, and they're going to hold on to this string value. Okay, so let's go ahead and define the seconds class in here. So it's an immutable class, immutable, okay, and it's called class seconds. And let's go ahead in here and say final string value, and it's in its constructor seconds, like this. You can see here, and we're going to hold on to that value. So we're going to say seconds, and then we're going to say value is equal to now, something like that. Okay. We also need to define another class for minutes. So I'm going to copy paste this code right there, that we call this then minutes. Let me see. Where did I jump? I don't even know where I jumped. Minutes. And let's change this constructor also to say it's minutes. Okay. So what we need now is, because we're using two streams in here, what we need is to have a reusable stream that we can just give it a duration, and it will just create a periodic stream for us. Okay. Because if you remember, these two, they're consuming a stream. They're using something called a stream provider, and then we're putting these two streams. I don't know why I'm showing four and mirroring my hand. No, we're putting these two stream providers inside a multi-provider in order to render this very simple UI. Okay, so let's say a stream of string, and we're going to say new stream, and then we're going to say duration, and this guy just returns a string, if I can spell, periodic, with the duration. And in here, when we get the value, we're just going to say we return now from here, and it returns a string. So you can see it basically creates for that given duration, every time that duration elapses, then we're returning the value of now. Okay. So what we need in here is to have a widget that can return and that can render the seconds value. Okay. So we're going to call it a seconds widget. So let's go ahead and do that. So, I mean, again, the reason I'm creating separate classes for these things is that because in this multi-provider, your multi-provider is going to hold on to both of its providers. In this case, one is like a minutes provider, the other one is a seconds provider. And if they both emit strings, somehow you need to be able to extract these strings and determine somewhere which one is a minutes, which one is a second. So it's always better to wrap them inside classes using which you can actually watch those values of those types easily with watch or select inside your provider or inside your build function. So let's go ahead and define a seconds widget, which is going to render this bad guy here. Okay, so let's go say STL, and we're going to call it seconds widget, just like that. And then we're going to go inside its build function. I'll bring up the note in here. We're going to use watch to watch any changes that happens to seconds value. Okay, so let's say final and seconds is context.watch, context.watch. And let's in here then say we are watching seconds. Okay, the method watch isn't defined for type context. How come? Oh, because we haven't. Oh, yeah. Well, we don't have provider. So we have to import and add provider extension. So I don't know how we missed that. Let's go into terminal in here and say pub Flutter pub add provider. Okay, that's very important. And then we're going to go ahead and import it as well. So let's see if Visual Studio Code can help us and auto import provider. So if I say watch, it doesn't. Let's go in here and say import package provider. And in the build context of our seconds widget, we're going to say watch. Now we have access to watch, and we're going to say we're watching any value is of type seconds. Okay. So in here, we're going to just create a very simple expanded with a container, because if you look how it looks like, it should expand like to maybe half of the screen or to the available portion of the screen. And if you put two of them together with a flex of one, they're going to take half of the screen width. Okay, so let's say expanded, and this is very similar to what we did in the previous example, so not much explanation is needed. So for the child, we're going to create a container. Okay, and the container for the second widget is going to be yellow. So let's say color is yellow. It has a height of 100, I believe. Okay, and its child is going to be a text of seconds value. Remember seconds class, it had a value here, so we're just rendering it inside a text. Okay, so like that and that, perfect, and a comma in here to get the formatting correct. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and define the minutes widget. So what I'm going to do is literally copy this seconds widget and bring it here right after minutes and paste it in here. Okay, so that's that. So for the build function of this minutes widget, let's copy it here. We're not going to watch seconds anymore, but we're actually going to watch minutes. So I'm going to say minutes in here and then minutes in here. Okay, so we're interested in any value of type minutes up the hierarchy in the build context in any provider available to our build context. Okay, so we're going to use a multi-provider in here to inside the build function of our home page. So we're going to go ahead as the body of our scaffold. We're going to say multi-provider. Just close it like that. You're going to get an error, but that's okay. Okay, so that's adding multi-provider as the body of our homepage. So what we're going to do in here then is to create our providers. So multi-provider, as you can see in here, requires a providers parameter. So it's a list of providers. You'll see some here. You see. So in this providers, we're gonna Actually, I don't want to jump over this. It's quite important. Let's go to providers. You can see it says single child widget is a list of single child widget. So if I say single child widgets, let's go ahead into the source code. Let's say, let me see if I can go into the source code for this. Single child. Did I write it correctly? Single child widget. Package provider single child widget, but we already have that. Late single child widget. It doesn't really let me go and have a look at that for some reason. Single child widget. Let's go into this providers, and in here, this is what I want. You can see it's an abstract class called single child widget, and you can see that it's inside nested. And I mentioned in the beginning of this chapter that nested is a package that a provider brings with itself into your projects. And this single child widget is something that your provider is using quite a lot. Actually, you can see, let's see, class multi-provider extends nested. So provider internally is using nested quite a lot. And I think I will talk about nested in this course, not in this chapter, but I think nested is quite an important one to talk about because provider is kind of like based on top of nested a little bit. So, but what we're going to do in here, we're just going to ignore all the business about nested and just go ahead and bring our providers into the array of providers mentioned here, okay? So we're going to create a stream provider. So let's say stream provider, which is a type of provider available in the provider package. And we're going to say value. And let's go ahead and put a comma in there. And the value in here is going to be that periodic stream for us, okay? So what we're going to do in here, actually, maybe we don't need that stream thing that we created up there. So yeah, I think we probably don't need this new stream guy. I don't think I'm using it here either, new stream, unfortunately. So let's remove this guy. We don't need it, okay? So let's just create our streams like normal person. So let's go ahead in here and create a little stream in here. So this value is your stream, okay? And let's go ahead and create it in here. So we're going to say a stream that provides seconds. It's periodic. Its duration is a constant duration of seconds 1. And every time it gets a value, it just returns the value of now, okay? Which is a function, just like that. All right. I really think that's it. Actually, no, we're not returning now. We're creating seconds like that. Okay. So that's the creation of our stream. So let's see how it looks like. Yeah, the value is that stream. It provides a seconds instance every second, and its initial value is just going to be seconds. So a new instance of seconds. So we have something to start with. Okay. So that's that. And then what we're going to do in here is to create something similar to the stream provider, but we're going to do it for minutes. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy this code here, and I'm going to go and paste it right after that. And in here, say minutes. And in here, we just say minutes 1, and we emit minutes, and we emit minutes in here as well. Okay. So now you'd be wondering, okay, so now that this thing is in place, actually, let me do select and run the application as well. While we're waiting, we could implement the rest of this. You may be wondering now, okay, now we have the providers in this multi-provider, but where are the widgets? No, none of these is actually emitting any widget. And the way to do that is to go to your multi-provider. It has a property in here. It's called child. Okay, so this child is then going to have access to the various providers that you create inside your multi-provider. Okay, I can see our application is running now. I'm going to close the widget inspector so we have some more space like that. And builder, yeah, you can see we don't have a child. We're getting an error. So right after the array of providers, we're going to go and add a column and a row for our multi-provider in here. So let's go ahead and say the child has a column with children, and the first child and the only child is actually a row with children of const empty array for now. Okay, just like that. So in here, we're then going to create our widgets. So very simple. We're going to say seconds widget, and we're going to say minutes. minutes widget, like that. I'm going to save the app. Let's go in here. I think both are yellow. So the seconds one should be yellow and the minutes one should be blue. So that's a problem with copy pasting. So let's say blue here. And I mean, we probably are not going to wait like a whole minute for that one to fire. What we could do though is to go to our minutes widget and kind of like fake that in the stream itself inside seconds instead. So say every 5 seconds it changes itself. So let's see now if this changes every 5 seconds. There we go. So it works. It's just 1 minute is quite a long time to wait for it to fire its event. Okay. So that was a lot of information. I know we talk a lot about provider. I think this video is now more than 2 hours. It's like 2 hours and maybe 20 minutes is going to be, but I think it's worth it. It's provider is such an important thing in Flutter. That is such an important package in Flutter that I think it's worth spending time learning how it actually works. So we talked about ChangeNotifier, ValueNotifier. We've talked about providers. We've talked about stream providers. We've talked about multiple, multi, as you can see in here. We talked about multi-provider. We've talked about select, watch, provider of. We've also talked about read, how to interact with your providers. So this is all great stuff, but we shouldn't forget that let's just save, so no errors. We shouldn't forget that we always commit our code. So let's say git init, and I'm going to say git add all, and then let's say git commit step 1 in here, okay? And we're going to say then git tag step 1 as well. So that's for tagging and committing our code. Sometimes I kind of run ahead of myself and start explaining things before I brought up the caption for it. And so sorry about that. So as I mentioned, we've learned a lot about providers. We put them into practice. We created 2 applications that kind of like very simple applications, but they explain the behavior of provider package. And I mean, I wouldn't be able to write 3 complete applications. Otherwise, this video will be more than 20 hours long. So I know that because doing one application in my free Flutter course, entire application took about 36 hours. So by the way, you're more welcome to go and watch the free Flutter course, which is available freely also on YouTube in my channel. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope actually to see you in the next one.